An Affliction of the Heart, Volume 3, Hybrid, by Anonymous Pegasus. Chapter 4, Felony, Mistemeanor. Swarm stared glumly at her half of the paper set up on the easel. A black sputter of ink was strewn across the center of it, from the careless flick of wrought iron's hoof. Swarm was wrestling with the idea of putting an image on paper. It was a crazy idea to her.
Miss Acumen?
Swarm asked uncertainly, looking towards the older mare. The teacher stepped closer, looking Swarm up and down.
Yes, is there a problem?
Swarm looked down at her forehoofs, mincing them back and forth nervously.
How do I paint?
Sparkling Acumen paused at that, a deep frown creasing her already wrinkled face.
What do you mean, how? I don't know how,
Swarm said with a simple nod.
Can you teach me?
Sparkling Acumen blinked once before she stepped closer to the easel and picked up a brush. Leaning in, she drew a simple circle, a line for a neck, 4 lines for legs, and then another circle for the head. She dipped the brush into the water, swished it around to get it clean, and then went for the red, scrolling in a mane and tail with a practiced flick of her wrist. There. Swarm blinked, her head tilting slowly to the side.
What is it?
Sparkling Acumen stared for a long moment, beginning to look offended.
It's,
She paused, turning to wrought iron.
Iron? What is this a drawing of?
It's a pony, wrought iron said with a shrug. Swarm stared, blinking once.
No, it's not.
Sparkling Acumen paused again at that, leaning closer to the point, before pointing at the end of the brush.
Look. Mane, tail, body, and head.
Swarm blinked and leaned closer, her expression bewildered.
But it doesn't look anything like a pony.
Sparkling Acumen sighed faintly, rubbing her forehead with a hoof.
It's a painting. It's not supposed to be perfect.
Swarm frowned deeply, rubbing a hoof through her mane uncertainly.
Then why bother painting at all?
The teacher stared at her student for a long moment, shaking her head.
Because it's fun.
Swarm blinked at that.
Oh, okay,
she said brightly, moving forwards to pick up the brush. Sparkling Acumen stared at the young filly for several long moments before she leaned in closer to whisper into her ear.
Swarm, who's your mother? Kuno?
Swarm responded idly, staring intently at the canvas.
What kind of a pony is she?
Sparkling Acumen queried. Swarm blinked once, shifting her attention to the teacher.
She's not a pony. She's a changeling.
Sparkling Acumen stiffened slightly at that, her brows furrowing.
I suspected.
A series of heated whispers started up from the easel behind Swarm, and her ears reddened as she realized that other fools had heard. She cast her gaze towards wrought iron, but he was focusing on his drawing, and didn't seem to have heard. Warren sighed faintly as he trudged along the long road towards Ponyville, limping heavily on his bad hoof. He had several things to do in Ponyville. He had to find an employee that was capable of at least helping tend to the Aurora crop, get supplies from the house and for the Aurora itself. There was a special fertilizer to buy and mix with certain herbs to ensure that the Aurora didn't die. There was also a certain thing that intended to do in Ponyville that he was careful to keep from Kuno. He had gone far enough to ensure that she stayed home just to make sure she didn't inadvertently find out about it. After almost an hour of walking, Warden finally made it to Ponyville, pausing to sit on a park stool and rest with a faint groan. Warden missed flying. It was so much faster and simpler than walking, especially with such a busted hoof. Disconcertingly, Warden noted that his good hoof was thicker and more defined in musculature than his bad hoof. His crippled limb was wasting away from lack of use. A heavy sigh left the Pegasus as he rolled off the bench to continue into town, huffing faintly. It felt like he might be coming down with something. Warren thought it likely that it would be a common cold, as he had spent enough time in the rain and cold recently to warrant it. Warren headed for the garden center first, pushing his way through the old bead curtain and into the dark shop. The smell of fertilizer, acrid and powerful, immediately assaulted his senses. The Pegasus paused, lifting his nose and inhaling deeply, before giving a low sigh. He had always loved that smell. A strangely familiar scent found his nostrils underneath the pungent aroma of fertilizer, and Warren turned with a blink towards the corner of the room. An earth pony was arranging the packets of seeds to make them line up all neat and proper. She had a lovely green mane and the softest of brown coats, with a single green plant shoot on her rump as a cutie mark. "Greenhoof?" Warren asked incredulously, staring. The earth pony swiveled around to peer back over her shoulder, giving a wry smile. "Well, fancy running into you here, Warden." "Small world, huh?" Warden asked, shaking his head slowly. "What are you doing here?" "I got sick and tired of the cold, and Mint Green needed a place to go to school. The Crystal Empire ponies are, well, let's just say I didn't want them learning in their schools," Greenhoof said with a firm wave of her hoof. "Mint Green? Did you have a foal?" Warren asked with a faint laugh and a shake of his head. Greenhoof snorted once, raising a brow. "Why so incredulous? Last I checked, I had the needed bits and pieces to have a foal." "You just never struck me as the motherly type," Warren said, scratching his chin with a hoof. "You were pretty obsessed with your work. I didn't think you'd have time to raise a foal." Nodding in understanding, Greenhoof turned back to the row of seed packets, making sure they were all straight. "Well, Stunning Facet and I divided our time to raise him." "Ah, Stunning Facet? Isn't he that rich crystal pony that runs the jewelry store?" Warden queried. "He relocated here to Ponyville with us. He sources gems straight from Miss Rarity and cuts them to fit jewelry. It's pretty lucrative work," Greenhoof said with a faint smile, turning to begin straightening up a bag of fertilizer. "Then why are you working here in this old place if your husband makes so much money?" Warren asked, genuinely confused. "Well, after Mint Green started going to school, I had a lot of time at home alone. I don't really know the whole gem business, and I needed something to do during the day so I don't go stir-crazy," Greenhoof admitted, grimacing and rubbing a hoof through her mane. Warren nodded in understanding. "So you're not really tied to any one place?" Greenhoof paused at that, and then gave a wry smile. "I think I got this job more as sympathy than any real need for a helper." "Well," Warren paused, giving a helpless shrug, "I need an extra worker. I have to produce some more of my crop." "And what exactly are you growing?" Greenhoof asked carefully. Warren gave a slow smile at that. "How would you like to help grow one of the hardest to grow plants in all Equestria?" Swarm stared up at her half of the page for a long, long moment, frowning deeply. Wrought Iron had already finished his side of the page, having painted a dark splotch that he said was an anvil with a hammer on top of it. It was just a meaningless shape to her.
Miss Acumen?"
Swarm asked, looking up at the older mare. Sparkling Acumen frowned slightly, stepping closer to the filly, leaning down to converse quietly. "What's the matter this time, Swarm?"
"What do I draw?"
Swarm asked uncertainly, looking around bewildered.
"Anything you like."
Sparkling Acumen responded with a warm smile. "Why not your father?"
"My father's too white,"
Swarm said immediately.
"and the page is white. There's no white paint. It would be weird."
"Very well. Do you have any brothers or sisters?" Swarm shook her head firmly. "What are your favorite places?" Sparkling Acumen asked.
"I really like Daddy's garden and the Everfree Forest,"
Swarm admitted, rubbing a hoof against her chin.
"but they're both really far away, and I can't draw them if they're so far away."
"Very well. Draw the easel," Sparkling Acumen suggested. Swarm blinked and her pupils dilated slightly before she snorted and shook her head rapidly as if to clear it.
"But then I'd be painting a picture of an easel on it that had a picture of an easel on it that had another picture of an easel on it, and I can't paint that small."
Sparkling Acumen sighed faintly, shaking her head. "Very well. Draw whatever you can see out the window. The palace, perhaps?" Swarm pondered on that for a long moment, before she nodded slightly, smiling brightly.
"I'll draw the palace."
Warren hummed happily as he made his way towards a small house on the outside of Ponyville. It was a cottage, with a neat front garden and a swing hanging from an apple tree. It was a very unassuming place, but there was something off about the cottage. The faint smell of antiseptic wafted from inside, and even though there were warm candles lit and happy paintings in the hallway, there was no mistaking that this was not a residential address. Staring up at the house, Warren slowly walked down the path and to the front door, knocking lightly and clearing his throat nervously. A young unicorn mare stepped out from one of the black rooms, smiling and bowing respectfully.
Mr. Warden, I assume?
Warren nodded wordlessly, licking his lips.
Right this way, sir,
the mare said, pivoting and then heading down the hallway. Warren followed her, feeling a little bit nervous and twitchy. It was his first time here, but the reputation of the place had preceded it. There were several closed doors, and the faint sound of moans and groans coming from behind them, as well as the odd muffled squeal. The young mare led him into a small room with a rather wicked-looking harness hung from the ceiling. There were purple candles on a shelf, cheery paintings on the wall, and a soft nest of cushions, as well as several tools and instruments that looked painful, to say the least. Warren cleared his throat, giving a nervous exhale.
Here's my bits,
he said, offering the small pouch.
We know you're good for it,
the mare said with a warm smile, motioning towards the harness.
This will immobilize you completely. You are allowed a bullet if you think you will scream. But the rooms are soundproofed, and we're far enough away from the town so that no one will mind. Sometimes the screaming helps some of our patients.
Warren stared up at the imposing set of braces and harnesses, his ears splaying. He liked to think he could keep from screaming, but past experiences told him otherwise.
I think I'll take the bullet.
The mare nodded knowingly.
Well, come climb up and I'll get you set up. Our specialist is with another patient right now, but she'll be done in a few minutes.
Warren nodded quietly, sliding up to the harness and eyeing it curiously.
How do I get into this thing?
The mare tilted her head and her horn glowed, her magic literally lifting him off his hooves and into position. Warren's weight came down across the harness, his hooves a few inches from the floor, and then the mare was there to soothingly stroke at his mane.
Try not to panic. We're not going to do anything too unreasonable to you, she murmured soothingly, starting to cinch down on the straps. It is your right wing that is injured?
Warden nodded jerkily.
Please try to be gentle on it. My right hoof is also crippled. We'll try not to hurt you, Sir Warden, but please remember, given what we are going to do to you, the pain is almost a certainty,
the mare reminded gently. Warden nodded shakily.
I know. I knew that when I made my appointment.
The mare smiled at that.
Good. Some ponies come here thinking they're in for some kind of spa treatment. It is nice to know that you've done your research.
The straps were all tightened and cinched down, and then it was time for Warden's wings to be extended. The mare was gentle, but he still winced in pain when his right wing was fully extended into a position that it hadn't held in many months.
Now, I'm going to give you a ball to hold, Warden. This is very, very important. If at any time you want us to stop, then you need merely drop the ball, you understand?
The mare asked warmly, smiling at him. Warden nodded jerkily.
Yeah, I know how this works. Try not to drop the bullet, the mare said as she placed the ball in his hoof. If it's dropped in the middle of a strenuous activity, then our specialist won't stop to replace it. We've had patients almost bite through their own tongues in that instance.
Warren paled at that, starting to rethink his choice.
Now, I'm going to give you something that will make you feel good and content, okay? You're not allergic to opioids, are you?
Warren shook his head slightly.
I don't think so. Good. Now, bite this,
the mare said, holding up a vaguely cylindrical length of wood with a purple cloth around it. Warren opened his mouth, taking the bullet into it and biting down on it firmly. There was the prick of a needle at the base of his neck, just above his shoulder, and he shuddered as a wash of contentedness washed over him. He barely even blinked as an oriental mare unicorn stepped in through one of the back doors, brushing a strand of mane out of her face.
This is Mr. Warden?
she asked brusquely. The younger mare nodded.
Yes, ma'am. Very well. Let's get started,
she said, scooping up a jar of powder and dusting her hooves with it. Swarm stared up at her newly created picture of the Canterlot Palace. She'd had to cut it off prematurely when she found out she had started painting too big. The other foals had all gone to recess, and she was still sitting there painting, scratching the surface of the paint with the blunt end of a paintbrush, and blurring it with dabs of a tissue, and even with a piece of paper she had found, when she wanted a rougher texture. Sparkling Acumen sat beside her, staring over her shoulder in awe.
You've never painted before?
The mare asked, dumbstruck.
Never,
Swarm said with a faint shrug, her wings giving her the faintest of flutters.
Isn't it obvious? It looks horrible. I can barely even tell what it is.
Sparkling Acumen slowly shook her head, staring at the rendering of the Canterlot Palace. It was an almost perfect painting of the palace. Swarm had somehow managed to capture the texture of bricks in the painting, and the color of the sky was a perfect match to the sky outside, even to the point where it faded more white along the horizon. The foliage in the cliffs were just smudges of brown and green, mere impressions of greenery and mountain. But the castle itself was sharp and focused. However, there was something off about her picture. Sparkling Acumen couldn't put her hoof on it exactly, but something about the painting made her uneasy. It reminded her of when the changelings had attacked, and merely glancing towards the castle had sent chills down her spine. It emanated evil somehow back then, and now, on the foal's painting, it did the same.
Swarm, are you trying to make this painting unsettling?
Sparkling Acumen asked quietly. Swarm blinked once, shaking her head.
I'm just trying what I see.
Well, what do you see when you look at the palace?
Swarm pondered that for a long moment, scratching her chin with the blunt end of the paintbrush, marking her gray fur with black paint unknowingly.
I see the palace, where the evil princess lives.
Sparkling Acumen stared at the foal for a long, long moment, shaking her head slowly.
I think I shall need to talk to your parents.
Warren stepped heavily down the front steps of the small cottage, a faint, distracted smile on his face. Although everything was still a little hazy from the opioids, he was told that everything had gone smoothly. There was a strong sense of wrongness that had been righted, something that he hadn't even been aware of, even though his hoof, and especially his wing, ached far more than usual due to the rough treatment they'd received. The young mare waved him farewell from the door, smiling warmly.
Come back soon, Mr. Warden. We'll be happy to help you out with your other little problem.
Warden nodded weakly over his shoulder, before starting to limp back towards the center of Ponyville. He would catch a carriage halfway to Canterlot, and at least save him a half hour or so of walking. Warden was just happy that, during the entire ordeal, he had managed not to scream.